It's a pleasure to be here with an audience and colleagues who only want to speak about empathy for an entire morning and afternoon. It's my favorite topic. This is a little different from the previous presentation. Most of what I'm going to say is based on an empirical study that I did with my colleague Ciências. And there are a few reflections of my own because I'm really obsessed with finding out what builds up empathy and what can promote empathy in some of these early influences. So it's a study on, basically it's an empirical study on development, and moving forward, this is stuff already. Let's go forward. Yeah. So a lot similar to what was said before by Christina. Empathy is a multidimensional concept, but it's thought to have two main dimensions that are quite consensual. So one of them is the cognitive component, mentalizing about the other's emotional experience. So that involves making an effort to imagine how awful the other one must have felt or how good the other one must feel. And then an affective component, experiencing a relevant emotional response to the other's emotional experience. So picking up the same example, I feel awful seeing you that way. It's a vicarious, internal, embodied experience of emotion. Now, empathy varies inter-individually, so we're not all the same as regards to feeling empathy or even experiencing cognitive empathy. And it's thought to be part of one's personality, a dispositional trait. So if one scores high in empathy, it's said to be highly empathic or an empathizer, as Nettle calls it. And empathizers are expected to respond strongly to empathy triggers and traits. Empathy largely predicts a number of things, mostly pro-social behaviors. That's what we mostly expect from an empathizer. But lately, a lot of different things have been predicted from empathy, including abiding to COVID-19 safety rules. So yeah, there's a lot to be said about empathy. Now, why study its development? So there's a lot that has been studied on the development of empathy, mostly studies with babies and children. So early studies show that empathy increases from childhood to adolescence globally, and that there are marked differences between boys and girls in terms of their neural networks, in terms of how speed they mature, and so yeah, that's quite established. Throughout the lifespan, there's not a lot of information on what goes on. So there are some studies that show no differences across ages. They don't even compare people with different ages. So they're adults and that's it. And, you know, it's a bigger time span. Some show that people have reduced empathy towards old age, and there are some indications that perhaps there's a link between keeping empathy high in old age and having high formal education and mostly the richness of one's social interactions. So these are just two studies, so I'm talking about very limited evidence on what goes on through the lifespan. Now, empathy in adolescence, surprising as it may be, is less studied than in childhood. But I think it is the key to understanding adult empathy, its influences, its nature, so the very nature of empathy. How can you understand it if you don't understand how it's built up and its trajectory? So we departed from thinking about what do we know on emotional development through adolescence. And adolescence is really critical to emotional experience and to emotion regulation. That's also very well documented. And it has been a gap. What I feel has been a gap is knowing if empathy follows a linear path, for example, from early adolescence towards late adolescence. And we can think that if empathy follows the path of other emotional experiences, then it would peak around mid to late adolescence, because that's where most the intensity of emotional experience occurs, and empathic responses would have been slightly downregulated towards late adolescence, as do other emotional experiences. Um, yeah. And supposedly it increases towards adulthood because adult studies show that they have higher empathy. So studying empathy is also something that might make us have some clues on how do we read others' emotional expression, emotional behavior. There's a lot of contradiction in research about how much does empathy really predict our pro-social behavior, and how does it help us to identify what's going on with other people. And trait empathy. There's a lot of feedback here. It is predictive.
Try a different way because the microphones are terrible. We have
I've
problems
been
here.
moving
People from
backwards.
home are not hearing, so I need just 1
Yeah.
minute to try
Yeah.
to fix this.
Okay.
Okay, now try to speak now.
Okay, testing. So even though I even. Yeah. So even though sounds good. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay.
No problem. Yeah. As low as it goes. Yep. Okay, so it's probably going to superimpose on something else that's going to appear on the screen, but we'll see. Anyway, so going backwards, what was my point here? Yeah, even though trait empathy predicts behavior, states of mind, and all that, it doesn't predict the same way across targets. So understanding empathy means understanding it towards different targets. That's the main idea. That's something that I have on my mind for a long time. Are we equally empathic with a child, with an elderly person, with a non-human animal? I mean, are we, with a person of our own gender, with a different gender? We are not, and that's what many of the much of the criticism on empathy or on even promoting empathy has been about. It's that there are some processes that we know affect empathy. For example, familiarity with the target, identification, personal bonds, the target being under a spotlight, and a lot of other ones. So this is stuck. That's it. How maybe it's this one. Yeah. So studying empathy across different targets and how congruent empathy is across these different targets seems really critical to understanding the nature of empathy. That's my idea.
Vamos fazer desaparecer isto, assim já não é preciso. Está hide. E, ok. Quando, pronto, agora é só clicar aqui.
Só clicar aqui.
Porque quando se passa a mão no mousepad, entrava. Ok.
Oh, okay, so that's it. Thank you. Ainda está em gravar. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to try to speed up things a little bit. We had, this was a study, actually a couple of studies within a larger number of studies in a project, in a developmental project we had. But I'm going to show you bits of these two because especially the first one is really important. So this combination of two studies, overall, they meant to explore study one, the developmental pathway of empathy, and examine the congruency between two targets. These were empathy to humans and empathy to animals. And the second study meant to explore how empathy predicted the ability to interpret emotional expression, and also some embodied affective responses. So main question from study one: how does empathy measured in various dimensions vary across pre-adolescence, middle adolescence, late adolescence, and adults? So this was across all these groups, and for humans and non-human animals. So these were the big questions. We explored several hypotheses. We tested several hypotheses in second two. One was that, you know, the higher the trait empathy, the better would be the emotion identification. The second hypothesis is that emotion identification accuracy would be mostly predicted by two dimensions of empathy. So we were studying 4 dimensions, and 2 dimensions we thought would be highly predictive. That would be empathic concern, so the emotional component of empathy, but it's sort of an informed emotional dimension, and perspective taking, so the mentalizing effort to understand the other one. And we wanted to know if skin conductance, we also measure skin conductance. So it's a physical measure of arousal. It's a measure of activity of the peripheral nervous system, of the sympathetic nervous system that's always activated when we experience emotion, if that would also be a predictor of this accuracy. So we studied a large group of teenagers. So in the table, you can see they were split into age groups, and they were tested in their own schools. We also tested adults, big group of adults as well, in the psychology facilities. We took measures of empathy. So 2 measures of empathy. One of them was a self-report measure, it's interpersonal reactivity index, or ERI, widely used in psychology, and it's multidimensional. And that's something that we really wanted to measure, the perspective taking scale. And there's a personal distress, because empathy at the emotional level involves distress, being affected at a very implicit and automated way by the other's experience, empathy concern, and a fantasy scale that relates to identification. It measures how much you identify with a character, with someone else, and so that's also components of empathy. So 24 items later, they were done. And then there is an animal empathy scale. We use the Portuguese version that we have previously validated, and that measures. There's also a little bit of a cognitive component in the Portuguese version, but mostly emotional empathy. And so that's what we did. And in our second study, I'm going to study all the methods and then all the results together. We used a subset of the teenage group. There were volunteers, so just a few of them, so not exactly the same age range. They volunteered to participate. Some of them had turned 18 already. And so here, the apparatus was somewhat different. We used a self-reporting measure of valence and arousal. So that's scale just made out of pictures where you can pinpoint in the computer screen the intensity of how you feel. There was skin conductance responses that are taken, were taken with an amplifier system and connecting your 2 fingers, bipolar electrodes, and then a measure of emotion identification where people had labels and they could pick in a computer screen the label that best fit what they were seeing. And what were they seeing? They were seeing emotional stimuli. They were seeing videos. So we had 24 trials for each participant, and they were seeing videos, like a video of a chimpanzee in an emotional context. So we had humans, we had chimpanzees, and we had dogs, and we had two different videos per emotion per target. So, you know, 2 different people, 2 different chimps, 2 different dogs. And so people would go through this, and these were very short videos, and they were, importantly, they were natural videos. So they had been obtained in previous experiments where we had recorded the expressive behavior after inducing emotions. And, you know, so, you know, these are some of the results of our first study. There are lots of results, but importantly, age and gender predicted self-report in empathy. So it accounted for 23% of variance in the animal empathy score and 20% of the variance in the human empathy score. And here are wanted the other one first. Anyway, look to your right, and you can see the trajectories. That's what we really want to know about. So we look at the animal empathy, and we see that from 13 to 14 years old onwards, it's all the way up into adulthood. So it's a regular increase. When we look at human empathy, it's not quite exactly that way, but there's also a tendency to increase. And one important thing, if you look at all these graphs, so animal empathy, human empathy, and then 4 subscales, the 4 dimensions of the human empathy, all of them have one thing in common. And that is that empathy already starts high at 11, 12 years old. So at our youngest sample. And empathic concern, which is really one of our major concerns starts really, really high in both boys and girls. It always starts higher in girls. So, that was expected, but it starts really high in both of them. Now, the paths are somewhat different and not necessarily all the way upwards in all these different dimensions. For example, the identification scale, it goes upwards from 13 to 14 years old onwards into adulthood, but they differ. But main point to keep, I'm going to keep this as well, is that we have them starting really high, and that empathy towards animals somewhat grows higher and more steadily towards adulthood. Now, this is unexpected, and I'll talk about that later. So study two, how much does empathy predict the identification of emotions? Well, not a lot, and that is also a surprise. So the major predictor of identification, it's the emotion itself. Positive emotions are much easier to interpret and to, provide a correct label for them. And trait empathy, it does predict, okay, not as much, and it only predicts the identification of negative emotions. So I had a bunch of bivariate correlations that I just skipped. No one can see anything, but you'll be able to see it in a paper afterwards, or in this, slowly in this video. And the physical responses, so the amplitude of the skin conductance response, also predicted something that was the identification of positive emotion. We thought a lot about that. I mean, what does this all mean? Much of this was unpredictable. So there was a global progression in empathy towards the higher adult empathy. This happened especially for animal-directed empathy. This is sort of this pathway upwards is consistent with what we know about the brain development in adolescence. And there was also a validation of this consistent gender difference, always in favor of females. And this important result where we see that pre-adolescents already have really high emotional resonance to others' emotions by having relatively high, but doesn't grow that much upward. It's relatively constant empathic concern. So the emotional dimension of empathy. So we think this is really something to stick with educators and with parents, because they are able. We should expect them to have empathy-driven responses and to entail in compassion, pro-social behavior, and all that. And study two, I think I will highlight a few things that resulted from it. So globally, empathy predicts recognition, but this is a very modest prediction, and it's only of negative expression. So this makes sense because we have a lot of studies behind showing us that negative emotion is very hard to detect. It doesn't vary enough between different negative emotion experiences. It's hard to detect. So if positive emotion is easy to detect, and it is way so much easier, then we don't need that much empathy to detect it, right? What we really need is empathy for the negative emotion. Otherwise, we're all pretty good at detecting positive emotion. So we need to be more empathic to detect negative emotion. And think about embodiment, about skin conductance response predicting only the positive emotion ID, made us think that perhaps it's because, not only because the negative are so much harder to interpret, but because if you don't process signals properly, then you don't understand it's positive either. And that was a problem with some of the humans and with some of the chimpanzees. So apparently you can only have this reaction if you somewhat appraise it properly. So otherwise you will not have this response. But why does this matter to understanding better the nature of empathy? And I'm about to finish. There's a lot of information on how emotion experience arises in somewhat different ways across different cultures. Not all the influences that we suffer, not only on how we express emotion, but how we experience and understand this expression. Just a few days ago, there's a very nice paper that came out in Nature Review Psychology on how compiling a lot of information on this and showing how the emotions are shaped primarily by mother and infant interaction, then later on by peers and teachers and, you know, wider group of people. And in adulthood, they differentiate so much more. Our representations are much more diverse because of the richness and diversity of our social experiences. So for me, the early development of the emotional component of empathy that we found out so high and so relatively stable, and then even sort of down-regulated towards adulthood, tells me that it might reflect early influences on emotional development. So you develop it really early, and these influences are the most important for you to build up your empathic trait. So really nice example of an entwinement of biology and culture. And the further increase of the mentalizing component, not shown here, shown before. So the perspective taking toward adulthood, and more in females than in males, might indicate there's also an entwinement here of nature and culture. So accommodating further social expectations that, you know, bear their weight more on women than men, and maybe needs for social interaction that also create further further boost to this increasing perspective taking. Now, the animal-directed empathy increasing this much and this steadily towards adulthood was what made me think most. There are many hypotheses on the table. It might reveal a second order priority because, you know, in society, we suffer more pressure to be empathic. It's a normalizing a pressure to be empathic towards our own species than to other animals, and this is why we exploit them so much, right? We have much more empathy to humans, but there's this social values and social pressure there. But there's another way of looking into this that might also explain why it's so high. Perhaps it's because it reflects more effective empathy, because we don't think as much about it. It's a more implicit experience. And so maybe it's not, it doesn't begin as high, but it reflects a more spontaneous growth of empathy that also matches quite a lot of what some studies have shown on the development of, you know, activity in brain areas related to empathy. So that's another possibility. It translates better emotional empathy. And of course, it may reflect nurturing proneness that grows it grows more once you are about to leave adolescence. But I think that the take-home message is that for further research, it might be worth inspecting animal-directed empathy or any other measure that might be developed for another target that not humans, that doesn't suffer as much social pressure, as a predictor of pro-social behavior to humans even, or across many different human targets, as a more spontaneous, implicit, less formalized empathy measure. And to finish, I think that to understand empathy, we need to do research on different targets. We need to find coherence that may indicate that a common trait overarching all these other different empathies toward different targets, where it might be the case, an overarching trait empathy, and that the poor correlation between different empathy toward different targets may indicate a really major role of social learning for empathy. And interventions to promote empathy will require training young participants as young as possible in being attentive. Attention here being the key to decode spontaneous expression of emotions, and more varied facial expressions of negative emotion, because this is where the problem is. This is where the big challenge is. And thank you very much. I was just, oops, I did something wrong. Yeah, there's a paper that's going to come out with, details on its studies in the next few days. So that if that interests you, there's a link there. And thank you very much for your attention.